This is the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson. Welcome. With me, as always, are Fiona Maddocks of The Observer and Richard Bratby of The Spectator. Although I should point out that we are, of course, still recording this remotely from our houses. The slightly loosened lockdown means people are moving around a bit more from today, but we all work from home anyway. Still no idea of when concerts with audiences will be able to start. It seems still a long way from being possible, but a little chink of light from Wigmore Hall and Radio 3 as they announced this week that they'll be broadcasting a series of live chamber concerts performed behind closed doors and under distancing rules, and that can only be wonderful news. And we'll be discussing what might need to change in classical music post-lockdown in next week's podcast. But this week, it's cellists. And choosing his top 5 cellists is a former cello soloist himself and currently principal of the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. It's Julian Lloyd Webber. Julian, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Great to see you.
Thank you for inviting me.
How has lockdown been for you and particularly the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire?
Well, it's been surprisingly busy, really. We're having meetings all the time about, how students can graduate, how the timetable can continue as best as possible. We were in a fortunate position in the sense that we were absolutely ready to go online because we've been doing this project in South Africa for 3 or 4 years now, once a week, and it's absolute sort of real-time internet. So we were very well prepared in that way. But then, of course, there's meetings now all the time about what happens in June, July, August, September, when we can get back in the building, what happens when we do go back in the building. And of course, a lot of these things are completely unknown and will depend on government advice.
And still such a new, wonderful building as well.
It's rather sad because we're going to do a virtual open day soon, and I'm sort of doing the intro for it. And of course, one of the saddest things is that the people, they can see photos of the building or films of the building, but they can't actually experience it. And that's unfortunate because it is a lovely building. And
you were in the news at the beginning of this year, sort of threatening to walk from your position because of the, as you saw it, the unequal way in which money was being given to conservatoires in London compared to outside of London. I guess a lot of that has gone out of the window really at the moment, since funding all round seems to be in a bit of flux.
Yeah, I don't know how much I should say about that, but it is still there. The issue's still there. And it all comes down to the Office for Students having decided that we're not a standalone institution as we're part of the university. That's really what it's all about. But I mean, anyone can see that we have a history going back to Elgar and 1885. So, I mean, it's an institution within an institution. We have Simon Rattles, our president. He's not president of Birmingham City University. He's president of Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. And it goes on. So I do feel that the Conservatoire suffers from a lack of funding. There's no question about that.
It reminded me slightly of, so many issues that one wants to discuss and, of course, people have to think about, but all of which have been pretty much obliterated by this one major issue that we've all had to face, isn't it? Okay, well, let's go to cellists then. Before you tell us your first choice, I left it, as I always do, very open. I just said top 5 cellists. So did you have a particular approach to this, a criteria that you set yourself?
I think there's one thing to say right from the outset. People talk about, he was or she was the greatest and the greatest cellist and all that. But actually, I think what we forget sometimes is that people were great at different things. For example, it's pretty obvious, I would think, that I would choose Rostropovich as one of these greatest cellists, but I wouldn't choose him for playing the Elgar at all, because he did. And really, it was quite obvious he didn't like it, and actually said so. He's not a great cellist for Elgar, but he's a great cellist for almost everything else. So I think we do need to be careful about saying this person was the greatest, and it's something that you do hear an awful lot. But then having said that, I probably would turn around and say Rostropovich was the greatest as far as I'm concerned.
Shall we start with Rostropovich? Why not?
I saw him play a huge amount when I was about 13. He did an incredible series of concerts in London, which he also repeated in New York and in Moscow. 13 concerts in which he played every single piece in every single concert, and all from memory. It was really quite remarkable, and I never forgot it. He just made a phenomenal impact on me as a player. I'd seen many other great cellists play in London, but he was the one that really made me think, so I'd like to do this for myself. I mean, he's quite a daunting prospect because he technically was absolutely amazing. One thing I did learn from him really was to try to memorize pieces, because as best as you possibly can, because I think that particularly perhaps for a cellist, that music stand there between the cello and the audience is quite a barrier. So that was something I really learned from him, to try and memorize everything, even pieces with piano, short pieces. I tried to work really, really hard on my memory. But I learned so many. I was lucky enough to interview him for a national paper a few years before he died. And the first thing I said to him was, I'm not going to ask you a single question about Prokofiev, Britten, or Shostakovich, because every interview I'd read with him was always about that. And he was completely poleaxed by this and said, well, what are we going to talk about? And so then he went on to do a really, really funny interview. My first question to him was, you've been married for 50 years, because he was married to the great soprano Galina Vishnevskaya. And I said, you've been married for 50 years, what's your secret? And he said, well, we never see each other. And I thought, and the interview went on like this. And I said, what's your first memories of London? And he said, oh, the red buses and the red phone book. And I just thought it was a completely different kind of interview, which was what I wanted. And as usual, he was very articulate and very amusing.
Thing is, though, you do have to talk about those composers, because he was more than just a great cellist. He inspired the greatest composers of the 20th century to expand the repertoire for the instrument.
He absolutely did, and it was a mission for him to get new music for the cello. Something else I tried to emulate, but was not nearly as successful. But I do feel it's really important for virtuoso musicians to look to the future. We can't just play music from the past. And Rostropovich was, I suppose, at an incredible time for music, because Shostakovich was very much at his peak. Prokofiev, even, going back to, I think they worked in the early 50s together. And Benjamin Britten, Ludoslawski, the list of composers that wrote for Rostropovich is really quite phenomenal, and he was a great example, I think, in that way. And I mean, if you're going to choose one piece played by Rostropovich, I really would appreciate you going for the Shostakovich First Concerto, because I mean, that's a magnificent masterpiece, and it shows him at his best. What's interesting, I know I'm talking too much now and there won't be any room for the other four cellists, but what's interesting is that I've come around now to preferring to listen to live performances and recordings of live performances. And there's one that he did of the Shostakovich with Svetlanov, which is very, very hard to find. I think it was from Moscow, and it's absolutely phenomenal. And I do love hearing that sort of extra excitement. I think it's very rare for artists to be able to really convey the excitement of a live audience in the recording studio. That's a real gift if someone can do that. And I always used to try to imagine that microphone as the audience, but it's still never quite the same as that wonderful relationship with an audience, which of course we're not having right now.
One of the things that struck me in the BBC4 programme, Julian, that you presented, which featured lots of clips of cellists playing with Rostropovich, was extraordinary commitment. I think you call it commitment and concentration, even when he wasn't playing. Rostropovich did have that extraordinary intensity about him. He was absolutely at the center of that music at that moment. Fiona, I want to bring you in on this too. I wonder whether Rostropovich was on your list, but what are your feelings about him as a performer?
Well, he was pretty much at the top of my list, just to be very agreeing with Julian here. I think what I particularly responded to, which is implied by what Julian has said, is that he had a phenomenal technique, but the emotion was so raw and so intense. And as a human being, he was such a big-hearted, generous person. And I was also lucky to interview him a couple of times to hear him talk about Bach, as well as these other composers that we've just been hearing about. he said, I play Bach every day. And that wasn't necessarily the composer we most associate him with, but he was a phenomenal all-round musician and big-hearted, generous figure. He took risks too. I mean, in the history of his life, in leaving the Soviet Union and so on, he was very daring, and it's hard to imagine just how challenging that must have been for him.
Well, in a way, I think that's what he brought onto the stage, wasn't it? That whole history that he had, he brought onto the stage and into the music. Richard, we should say that you are a cellist. What about you?
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't go that far in the presence of Julian, really. It's I'm a rusty, enthusiastic amateur. I'm briefly a professional. It's something I do for pleasure rather than anything else. Rostropovich, though, I mean, Fiona just touched on it, and I mean, it's also, Julian has touched it as well, it's just the bigness of the personality. There's this sort of tradition, beginning with Pablo Casals, who I'm sure we'll come back to, of cellists being more than just instrumentalists, of taking these sort of moral stands, these sort of being these personalities outside of music. You look at Rostropovich, you think of that phenomenal 1968 prom broadcast of the Dvorak Concerto, just after the Russians had invaded Czechoslovakia, the burning intensity, the moral conviction, the stance he took in the 70s when he defected, when he moved to the West. I remember him playing for the after the Armenian earthquake, playing one of the Britain suites, just searing on the television. Then, of course, I mean, do you remember that extraordinary episode after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when he was sort of, I think Russia's sort of fledgling democracy was under threat, and there he was on the tanks outside what was then the Russian Parliament, being attacked by the forces of the Soviet Union. He's got up there, you know, man must have been towards the very end of his life, facing the gunfire. This is in the 1990s. It was ridiculous to say it as a cellist. That made me feel proud, but I felt vicariously. This man who made us all seem bigger, made music seem bigger, made me, you know. And again, there's this phenomenal list of commissions. I mean, you cannot conceive of 20th century cello music without Rostropovich. And, you know, Britain, the three suites, the sonata, the symphony, the cello symphony of Prokofiev, as well as the little concertino, which I think he reworked for Rostropovich, the two Shostakovich concertos, but also Berio, works by Berio, Bliss's concerto, the Lutosławski and Dutya concertos, both of which you can't imagine the repertoire without. Absolute classics. As Julian says, it's an enormous obligation of the soloist to sort of give something more. And I mean, no one sort of, I think, gave more outside of his own career, than his own musical career, than Rostropovich did.
I was just thinking about the Britten cello suites, which are, I know, very central to cello repertoire and have become a mainstay. And I was just thinking ahead, I wonder which performance of those I might like if I were looking at recordings. So I looked up recordings thinking there'd be 3 or 4, and there were 23 recordings of the Britten cello suites, half of them by cellists I'd sort of vaguely heard of, but and it was just a reminder that how important these works that Rostropovich brought about, in effect, are.
Julian, you talked about his phenomenal technique, but I always think the greatness of him was that it wasn't about the technique. It was way beyond that. He was. I think I was going to mention Yo-Yo Ma later. I love these players that make the cello look like it's part of their body when they're playing. I always thought Rostropovich was like that. Although he had a very, very particular sort of stance, didn't he, with his cello? I think if you saw a silhouette of him with his cello, you'd still know it was him. But yeah. the technique wasn't really the thing. It was the sheer musicianship of it, the persuasiveness of his performance, really.
Well, I mean, as a cellist, when I saw him in concert, I couldn't take my eyes off him. I mean, yeah. I just found him totally riveting. And there was, in that interview that I was lucky enough to do with him, he was the only cellist I'd seen as a young player that sometimes I just couldn't. I look at what he was doing and I couldn't understand how he'd done it. It was so phenomenal. And I got the chance to ask him in that interview. I said, you know, there were times when I didn't understand how you'd done something. And he just said, nor did I. And I thought that was very interesting because there really was like a supernatural element to some of the things he was doing.
This was always the case with the great trumpeter Maurice Murphy. one of the greatest of all orchestral trumpeters, but he never ever really knew how he did it, which meant of course that he was a terrible teacher, because people would say, how do you produce that sound? And I don't know, I just do it. It was that pure natural ability that came through. Yeah. Well, I mean, I assumed that Rostropovich would be right there, and I think we right there at the top. I think that's wonderful, of course. Let's move on to Richard. Richard, who's one of your top cellists on your list?
Well, I don't want to usurp Julian's prerogative here at all. I hadn't realised that this cellist was Julian's teacher and had taught Julian. But there are a lot of cellists who are sort of familiar names, and one I revisited during this process and was absolutely astonished by sort of greatness that perhaps I hadn't fully realised before was Pierre Fournier. He's sort of called the aristocrat of the cello. That was a sort of nickname that record labels attached to him. I don't think that's quite right. There is enormous dignity, poise, shapeliness and musicality about his playing, but it was this incredible sunniness as well, this warmth. His sound just sounds like it's smiling. It has this radiance, this incredible communicative power. And at the same time combined with, I mean, it'd be easy to call sort of Gallic elegance. But at the same time, the elegance is never ever at the expense of expression. It sounds as if it's just music's being put to you plainly, clearly, no other way. And at the same time, with this huge smile on the player's face. And I mean, I'd absolutely be fascinated to hear what Julian had to say about Pierre Fournier.
I agree with everything you said there. I think the thing with Fournier, people who know he's playing, the first thing you would say was the sound. It really was the most extraordinary cello sound. I think possibly the most beautiful there's ever been. And it was interesting because people say, oh, well, it's not the instrument and it's this sort of thing. But actually in Fournier's case, it really wasn't the instrument. I remember when I went to study with him, I was quite young and I had I was about 20 when I was with him. And then I had a really quite rubbishy French cello, not very good at all. And one day he picked it up to demonstrate something on my cello for some reason. And it really did sound like Fournier. It's incredible. And to have that gift to be able to make an instrument your own, just by the incredible kind of technique he was using, I guess, with the bow and the vibrato and all the rest of it. It couldn't have been anyone else but Fournier, but playing on a really not very good cello. So that, I think that's one thing I would say about him. I also found him a very, very modest man. There was one time when I came for the lesson and was outside his front door, and you could hear these rooms right by the door, and he was practicing Prokofiev Sinfonia Concertante, which of course was totally associated with Rostropovich, and I know he never played it in concert. So of course I stayed outside listening for a while, fascinated by this, and eventually knocked on the door and I said to him, are you going to be playing that in concert? And he said, oh no, I was just practicing. And then he asked me, a young 20-year-old student, he said, do you think I should? And I thought that was just so modest, because, I mean, of course, and I said, well, of course you should, of course you have to, but I don't think he ever did.
Fiona, thoughts on Fournier?
I think as a non-cellist, I could also hear that beauty of sound, but I've only heard a few of the recordings, and I'm not familiar in the way that Julian and Richard are with what it is, or perhaps they're not really able to say what it was he did that was so. It was just very, very dignified in a thrilling way, not in any sort of pedestrian way, but as if he just it was very contained and alive. Seemed to be my impression.
It's interesting.
Others do a lot more action and.
It was interesting what Richard said there about him being called the aristocrat of the cello. That was the sort of the cliche about Pierre Fournier, which was always trotted out. But I don't think he particularly liked it. And there was one phrase that he really hated that people used to call him the slow movement cellist, which implied he didn't play the others quite so well. But you can almost see why, because he did play slow movements with this wonderful sound, and you can see why people might have said that. But on the other hand, he also could play the rest of the pieces very well too.
Was Fournier on your list there, Julian?
Yes, totally.
Good. Fiona, who's on your list?
I thought rather shyly that I would be lost in trying to do my list. And I in fact said to Richard, oh dear, not sure I'm going to come up with the goods here. And I actually found that I had 49 names on my list. Obviously not all in my top 5, but I think we have a sense that there aren't so many cellists as there are violinists, but actually there are an awful lot of real big communicative musicians. Rostropovich we've talked about at length as being the most outstanding example, but I think if I think about a cellist who's invited me into the repertoire and broadened the repertoire and not seen barriers and always seems to we talked earlier about making the instrument part of his body, and always playing with some sort of gracious smile and vivacity. I would say Yo-Yo Ma. I mean, a player who's embraced a far wider range of music outside the normal Western canon, but seems adventurous in what he does with the cello. And there does seem to be a huge 21st or late 20th century tradition of the cello not just being a nice recital instrument or concerto instrument or symphony instrument, but going outside and doing wider things. And I mean, I can think of names, but Yo-Yo Ma is the most outstanding in that respect.
Yo-Yo is definitely on my list too. It just, as you say, as a pure communicator, is definitely looking like the cello is part of his body. I loved the all of those other sort of not on the side, but because they're just as important to him, projects like the Silk Road project and various other things that he's done, which have brought in all these musicians from other areas. And he does seem to be one of those musicians who fits in wherever he goes. And it doesn't feel like tokenism. It doesn't feel like, oh, I'm a classical musician desperately trying to look cool. I think he just can do it. But he is a person who fits in to the wider world as well. Only the other day I was watching The West Wing. There he was in The West Wing. He pops up in all these TV shows, and I think anyone who's got a moment, please go onto YouTube and watch the I think it was called the American Pageant for the Arts, where Bernstein is conducting the orchestra in front of President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and introduces his new protege as a 7-year-old Yo-Yo Ma, who comes on. I mean, he's utterly adorable at 7, with his little cello. On he comes, and when he's playing, of course, it's totally Yo-Yo Ma. He hasn't really changed that much in his way and the way he carries himself. Even just it's such a delightful thing to watch. But yeah, I think he's a very important figure. Again, like a lot of the people that we've talked about over the weeks, he's another one that transcends the world, the classical world, isn't it? And people know who Yo-Yo Ma is. Julian, Yo-Yo Ma?
Yes, I mean, I've studiously avoided in my list choosing any living cellists because there are so many really fine players out there. I didn't sort of want to get too involved with singling one up. I mean, Yo-Yo Ma is a huge force for the cello, and as you say, will always be looked upon as an incredibly important figure. And I completely agree with you about him doing all these projects that seem to be very natural. The Silk Road, he made at least two CDs of Silk Road project. He did a disc of Piazzolla tangos long before most people did that, he's experimented, and it always seems completely natural. And of course, you only have to look at those Bach suites that he did at the Albert Hall, the whole lot in one go. His technique is almost infallible. I mean, he's a terrific technical player. As you say, the cello absolutely the whole body fits with him, doesn't it? And I would agree with you.
Fiona, back to you.
I don't know him. I haven't really met him except in one circumstance when I was waiting, and anyone who's interviewed Daniel Barenboim will be familiar with this, that the bell was ringing for the start of a concert, and I had to do the interview with Barenboim during the period of the bell ringing, i.e. about 4 minutes. And while I waited for him, he asked me, this was at the Philharmonie in Berlin, he said, I will go in there with Yo-Yo Ma. Yo-Yo Ma was warming up. It was his green room, and he had to have me sitting there for 20 minutes. Couldn't have been more charming or unbothered. And I think that showed a generosity of spirit that I've always appreciated.
Richard, Yo-Yo Ma?
Well, let us not forget Sesame Street as well on his long list of credits. I mean, it's that thing. I mean, that epitomises, doesn't it? I think in America he is a lead cellist, isn't he? Certainly for Americans and worldwide audiences, but certainly I think in that huge musical world of the USA, for people beyond classical music, he is classical music. He is the face of an art, really, which because of that, that easy willingness, that easy readiness to sort of think beyond the classical confines, which is probably more important in the USA, or certainly in Europe, if you want to reach a large audience. And yes, it's hard to imagine anyone else pulling that off.
When I was trying to pick my cellist, I wanted to try and avoid only soloists, actually, as it goes, because obviously there are a number of very fine cellists who aren't soloists, but are very, very fine musicians in their own right. And I was thinking of quartets, cellists in quartets. I mean, we just lost Martin Lovett, for example, last week, legendary cellist of the Amadeus Quartet. I think people like that should be mentioned. William Pleath, people like that. But actually, one of my first ones I'm going to say is someone who I knew a little bit sort of in the last 20 years or so was Douglas Cummings. And Douglas Cummings was the principal cello of the London Symphony Orchestra from the age of 22, which at that point, which was the late 60s, was very unusual that someone that young would get a prestigious job like that. In fact, I think he was the youngest to ever have a principal position in that orchestra. Nowadays, blimey, it's quite unusual to not be under 25 getting a principal position in a major orchestra. But Dougie was right there at the beginning. And what I loved about him, again, a similar thing to Rostropovich, was his utter commitment to what he did within the orchestra, though. You know, so often I think when you watch orchestras, I was seeing some old clips the other day. In fact, it might have even been in Julian's program about cellists. Behind the musicians, you think, behind the soloists, you see these musicians, you think, oh my God, they look so bored, or they're so miserable, and oh dear, they're just sort of getting through it. And you would never have said that about Douglas Cummings. It was the aura he gave, that he absolutely loved what he did. And I think in an orchestra that can be so valuable and actually pick up everyone else around you. And I know from other people who played with Douglas Cummings that was his feeling. He had this extraordinary energy that really did come off with everybody else. He kind of picked you up a little bit. There's so many things to watch with the LSO, Bernstein particularly, as well in the 70s, and of course Andre Previn, that are on YouTube that you can see, and on the LSO's website too, where you can see him and his just the great way he just held himself and the way he played. It was so sad because of course he was struck with a brain hemorrhage in 1982, I think it was, and was never the same again, was never really able to play fully again. It really was one of those great careers struck down far too early. And also a great man struck down far too early. He used to, I think, come into the LSO's, into the LSO offices and look through archive as part of his therapy, you know, because he could see the programs and remember things from those concerts, which, you know, is quite moving when you think about it. Such a great committed musician, and very much missed. But I want to stick up for the principal cellos of orchestras, and I think Dougie was one of the all-time greats. Julian, did you ever come across?
Yes,
Doug?
I knew him well, actually, because we both were with the same teacher, Dougie Cameron, who taught a whole generation of British cellists, and Douglas Cummings was one of them. And also, I remember him, he was the principal cello in all those concerts I saw with Rostropovich, and they, that big series, and they obviously already had struck up a really great rapport, you know, so I completely agree. And actually, he made a really good, in my view, recording of possibly my two favorite part suites, the second and the fifth, the minor key ones. I think that it's a beautiful recording, very romantic, and probably wouldn't, be top of people's lists because of that. But I think it really is lovely playing. It's like similar quality to Rostropovich in that he's like speaking directly to you. It's really lovely disc. If anyone can dig that one out, it's well worth finding.
Richard, orchestral cellists, you've known a few, I'm sure, but
yes, it's always that thing, isn't it? That as we were saying, how the cellists kind of step out and take lead. I mean, I don't know if Julian would agree with this. My feeling, having been a sort of orchestral cellist myself, is this idea: we always feel that the violins have the glamour and the glitter, and and the high profile, but we're the real leaders. We're the ones with the class, with the sensitivity, with the style, the panache. We see ourselves as very much on a par with the violins, I think. And it's interesting how many orchestral cellists, sort of take the lead within their orchestras in that way. I mean, the example I'm thinking of in Birmingham, obviously where I worked for many years, is Uli Heinen and his fellow cellist Simon Clugston. These are the ones who actually had the idea of setting up the Birmingham Contemporary Music Group. Rattle eagerly followed the lead, but it was those two cellists who took that initiative. Eduardo Vassallo, who's still with the orchestra, co-leader with Uli for many years in that section, is a phenomenally charismatic individual. His family played with Piazzolla in Piazzola's quintet. His father played with Piazzolla. Eduardo sort of knew Piazzolla as a boy. He sort of sees himself as the standard bearer of that tradition, and as well as being a terrific orchestral player and a really charismatic chamber musician, and I believe a phenomenally inspiring teacher. He's put together this terrific tango ensemble which plays around the Midlands and has released a couple of records and such zest about what he does. These are all sort of energizing figures in the life of the orchestra. You mentioned quartet cellists earlier. I mean, I never interviewed him, but I was privileged to witness Valentin Berlinski while he was still playing with the Borodin Quartet, which he did practically to within months of his death. I mean, it was a career of over 50 years, and there was an individual who embodied a tradition and embodied sound. I mean, I'm not convinced he was perhaps always the most congenial of musicians to have worked with, having read the various memoirs of that quartet. There's a clear case there of the cellist feeling he is in charge, and clashing repeatedly with the leaders of the ensembles. But at the end of his life, he comes on with that huge old school Russian sound, huge vibrato. He plays no one will ever play again the Nocturne of the Borodin Second Quartet with the kind of authority, with the kind of the sort of weight that Berlinski brought to it, and he really shaped that group.
One of my all-time favourite recordings of anything is the Amadeus Quartet and William Pleath doing the Schubert C major quintet. And I always think what's extraordinary about it, I mean, it's just an incredible recording anyway, I think possibly the greatest of that piece particularly, is the way in which because of course the addition is the cello for the quartet plus another cello, is the way in which they can have their individual sounds, so Martin Lovett and William Pleath, but at the same time blend absolutely perfectly, so that you often don't quite know, unless you really know the piece, who's who when you're listening to it in the lineup. I love that. I'm never quite sure how they managed to do that, but the ensemble of that recording I think is astounding. But to actually have the cello parts blend in that way with two very different players, I mean, I guess that's the skill of that one has to have with that piece. But
I think that's a real definition of a really good chamber player, that they can blend and come up, with those two cello parts of the Schubert you've got to sound as one, And there's another terrific recording of that by the Hollywood Quartet. And Richard probably will correct me here, but Eleanor Aller, I think she was the cellist in the Hollywood Quartet, and she was married to Felix Slatkin, who's were the parents of Leonard Slatkin, and she was a terrific player too, and did quite a lot of solo work.
Yes, I thought the Slatkin's not in the Hollywood String Quartet as well. They were all part of that whole kind of world, weren't they? Of doing lots of film scores as well, the Slatkins.
They were, but I'm not sure that they were in the quartet. Richard probably knows them, but Fiona knows.
Have a look we'll have to look them up. Fiona, you wanted to come in on this.
I also was thinking about chamber musicians, not so much orchestral, but that's been well spoken by Richard. But a quartet like the Emerson, which was partly founded by the cellist David Finkel, I think that was a quartet where you thought this is being led by the cello, and you really felt the personality of the cello. And he's not the cellist any longer. There's a wonderful British cellist, Paul Watkins, who's also a fine cellist. And then something like, I think in order to really be able to make those comments about a chamber musician, you probably have to have someone who's had a very long career. You mentioned Martin Lovett, but there's also Bernard Greenhouse, who played with the Beaux-Arts trio for so many years. And then just going back to a soloist who I believe, who we lost recently, who I think began as an orchestral and chamber player, and that's Lynn Harrell, who, if you listen to his recording with Itzhak Perlman and Vladimir Ashkenazy as a trio, there's not the same question of blending, because the cello doesn't have a competitor, there's only one cello, but the sound is, the music making is truly generous.
Julian, let's move on to your next choice.
Well, let's go right back to the past now. And actually, I've chosen two, I suppose you could call historical cellists that were very associated with the Elgar Cello Concerto. So let's bring a lady in now. And this would be Beatrice Harrison, who was sort of preeminent British cellist of the early 20th century. I've heard recordings of hers which have made a huge impact on me. A lot of them are not available now, but there's one extraordinary piece that she recorded called The Lament of Fanide Grove. And it's an Irish folk song, and I dare you to find it. It's impossible, but it's the most extraordinary playing, because she almost is extemporizing and obviously had a really fine technique. That didn't seem to worry her at all. And it's like totally ecstatic cello playing. You could probably say it's over the top, but I love it. And I just think she had this quality. You could see why Elgar loved her playing, because it was totally from the heart, totally from the soul. There's one famous story. I think they were going to play the concerto in Manchester, and just before the performance, Elgar seizes Beatrice and say, forget about the notes, forget about all that, just give them the spirit. And I'm sure she did. And obviously, but I don't know whether I could now go off the rails and throw in my other cellist, who was
Please do.
very associated with Elgar's concerto, to the extent that he actually gave the first performance. And this is Felix Salmond. There's a bit of controversy about that first performance, because everyone says it was a complete disaster and they were under rehearsed and all the rest, and I'm sure they were under rehearsed, but Salmond was a very, very fine cellist and would have known that piece backwards. And some of the reviews at that time of the first performance were actually good and didn't mention the apparent debacle of the orchestra. So I questioned that. And the story then was that Salmond was so devastated, he never played it again and ran off to America to teach at Curtis and would never play the piece again. That's not true. He played it several times with Elgar afterwards, and also played it in America in 1930. So I don't think it was quite the disaster that people say, but it is significant that Elgar then recorded the work with Beatrice Harrison and not with Felix Salmond, which I think even going back in those days, those times were because all to do with record contracts and things. But there's a wonderful recording of Salmond playing the little Grieg piece called To the Spring, which I think, we're talking about Fournier's sound. He also had this incredible, pure, beautiful, unadorned, I suppose, cello sound. So if you could find that one, that would be really good. So those are my two historic cellists, who were actually brought together in a sense by Elgar.
Richard, you wanted to come in?
Well, the point about Felix Salmond never playing it again, I mean, it was he played it with Elgar on the very first official concert given by the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, just 10 months later after the premiere in Birmingham, and extremely well by all accounts, probably rather better rehearsed, I suspect, on that occasion. I remember hearing about Salmond on a BBC documentary many years ago now, Radio 3, and I think the title of the programme was The Man Who Sang the Cello. and they played on that a recording of him doing the finale of the Beethoven F major sonata, and it was that again buoyant and lyrical at the same time. I was a bit frustrated this time around. I really struggled to find any decent recordings of him prior to this this project. So I was sort of had him on my initial shortlist, but sort of didn't really feel I was able to go any further because I lack of information. Beatrice Harrison, on the other hand, I mean, there is that classic recording of the Elgar, and I mean, she also wasn't she Delius's chosen soloist as well.
Yeah.
It was
Yes.
it's her and her sister performed the Delius double concerto for the first time, which and there's such different works in terms of the sort of tonal world.
This is interesting about Beatrice Harrison. Everyone sort of associates her, obviously, with Elgar, Delius, and that sort of period of romantic, early 20th century cello music. But she also was a great exponent, possibly the first in the UK, of the Kodály solo suite. So that immediately says, well, she had technique to spare. So she did play a wide range of repertoire. And if it's not impossible to find that Irish short piece, a little excerpt from the Brahms E minor, which she recorded with Gerald Moore, that's very, very good. And in fact, the ending of that last movement is taken at a massive fast speed. Really sounds a live performance, and I think that's something for me about recording. You know, sometimes recordings sound edited and too careful, and you know, an artist not wanting to sort of put a foot wrong, and that's why I think now I love listening to live performances. I
must listen to the Elgar recording. I have to say, like many people, I associate Beatrice Harrison with playing with the nightingales in her garden. That's the if you say the name Beatrice Harrison, that's the first thing I think of. Fiona.
A quick word on historical cellists that this is one we may have seen more than heard, which is Madame Suggio, who was painted by Augustus John, is in the Tate, and I thought she was perhaps she just put the dress on for the occasion and held the cello, but I looked her up. Julian will know about her because I think he got some award in her name, along with several other cellists. That she was a pupil of Casals, and actually, I think at some stage more than a pupil of Casals. I searched, as we all do, the internet for some playing, and I found the Haydn D major concerto, which sounded pretty wonderful with Barbarolli. She died in 1950, so I don't know when the recording was. With some wonderful sort of soupy portamento, but some very nimble ornaments. It's just worth digging out because it really was interesting to me. I hadn't known until now that she was a pretty serious cellist, and Julian will know more about her, I'm sure.
Well, you're absolutely right that she was certainly more than just a pupil of Casals, because nobody can quite confirm this. They may have married at some point, and nobody really knows. But Casals got insanely jealous of her. And this is a known fact, because you know she was really starting to make a big name for herself, and he would actually program concerts in a place she was playing. When he discovered that she'd be playing in, say, Lisbon, he would program a concert in Lisbon because he knew that it would take all her audience away.
That's a terrible tale.
Before we move off from Beatrice Harrison, just to mention, I was lucky enough last year to interview Shaku Canamason about the time his Elgar disc came out, and of course you remember it was extensively hyped as how he is deeply influenced by Jacqueline du Pré. It was a great, well, I mean, which cellist isn't deeply influenced by Jacqueline du Pré? But when I got talking to him, he did say that actually Beatrice Harrison was a player who really interested him. He'd really been digging around in recordings of the 1920s, particularly the London String Quartets as well. He liked that sound world. He's really, really interested in Beatrice Harrison's recording. And he told me, and we put this in gramophone, that he really saw that as Beatrice Harrison was more of an influence of him, perhaps her recording more of an influence than the more famous one.
When we recorded the podcast about violinists, the Sibelius concerto sort of emerged as almost our gold standard, by which we all of our favourite violinists had played it, and it was one of our favourite recordings and stuff. Are we saying, I mean, is the Elgar that central and important in the cello repertoire, Julian? I mean, I know you've recorded it, you played it many, many times. I remember your recording was picked as the favourite recording of a magazine I used to read a lot in the 90s called Classic CD. They always had a CD on the front, and it was a wonderful magazine, and they voted yours as the favourite recording above Jacqueline Dupre's and all the other ones we've been talking about. Is it so central to the repertoire, that piece?
Well, it absolutely is for a British cellist. There's no question about that. But then, of course, the danger with it is that you're always judged against Jacqueline Dupre. There's always that, the reason I actually held back from recording it for quite a long time because of that. But then I found, I had this association with Menu, and that gave me a lot of confidence to do it because, of course, Menu knew Elgar so well, and I found him a natural conductor to work with, actually, and a lovely person as well. But I felt in the end that Jackie's performance is one of the great recordings of all time, but I do feel it's intensely personal. It does actually differ from the score quite a lot, and I felt that my performance was different enough to make it valid to record it. And so that's the reason I went ahead with it. But I think it is extremely important. But going back to what we said at the very beginning about Rostropovich, he never recorded it, and I think it's a totally central British work, and I'm being slightly controversial here. Of course, it's played by cellists all over the world now, and you can't really call yourself a solo cellist if you don't play the Elgar Cello Concerto. So yes, but I think for a British cellist, it's an absolute benchmark, and not a very easy one.
For you, Richard, Elgar, an important part of the repertoire?
It's sort of what Julian said, really. I when I was growing up and learning the cello, it was Jacqueline Dupre all the way. I mean, it was around the time that she died so untimely that I sort of really got to know the piece, and that was it. That was the only way to do it. That was the only way to play it. And then, as Julian said, it's uniquely personal to her, the way she plays it. It's one of the great recordings of all time. But in some ways, it's kind of almost completely changed the way the concerto is perceived. It's sort of, that recording is so passionate, so direct, and so, unarguable almost. But it sort of changed the concerto into this sort of great, anguished, deeply emotional, raw piece, which, of course, is latent in the music, is there. But I think before that was this tradition, this is actually seen as this reflective, poetic, sort of almost fantastical work. All these other sides to the piece, which, if you let yourself try and imitate Jacqueline Dupre, you're going to get nowhere. It's you have to dive back into a score, I think, and find your own way through all the different layers of the thing, which is, I think, what Sheku was trying to do. And I also think I listened to Pierre Fournier's recording, which I think was with Bolt. Other people as well. I mean, the cellist I really liked a great deal growing up was my sort of first cello hero was Paul Tortelier, who plays it in a completely different fashion. There's a whole completely different approach, completely different sound quality, completely different sort of way of phrasing the thing. Yes, it's an interesting one. The Elgar to us is so central. I mean, sort of the piece I found myself using to test cellists against each other, strangely enough, was a Saint-Saëns A minor first concerto, because it just does put the cello very front and centre. I mean, the Dvorak obviously is the Everest of the repertoire, but there's just so much else going on in that piece. It's so symphonic, but it's not a great way for throwing emphasis onto a cello, whereas the Saint-Saëns, with its rather light scoring, its rather graceful, elegant writing that places the cello and its lyricism front and centre, is a very good way of testing players off against each other, I thought.
We've talked about Jacqueline Dupre in the context of the Elgar Cello Concerto, inevitably, but what about Jacqueline Dupre as a top 5 cellist? Is she on anyone's list? Is that a no?
My final cellist was and is Paul Tortelier, because again, I grew up seeing him play a huge amount, and at the time, I would say Rostropovich and Fournier too were clearly my favourites above him. But on the other hand, the more I've hear of his recordings, and the more you really listen closely to his playing, I think he was one of the most individual and charismatic cellists that's ever lived. And he was wonderful in this sort of bittersweet mid-20th century music. If you, one of my favourite cello recordings is his version of the Hindemith Concerto with Karel Ančel and the Czech Philharmonic. It's an incredible recording and wonderful playing of a much underrated work. And then he was really good at things like the Walton and the even Shostakovich one, and Honegger Concerto he plays beautifully, you know. So I really rate Paul Tortellier, and in fact I was rather brought up on his Elgar recording, the first recording he made he made two, but the one with Malcolm Sargent, which was my grandmother gave it to me. It's a 10-inch LP. It was my first cello recording that I ever had, and I think he plays it really beautifully. I mean, it's totally different to Jackie. And just to come in on with what Richard said there, I think one of the biggest problems with her iconic recording is that so many cellists, young cellists and student cellists, will completely try to copy it. And it's ridiculous because it was such a personal recording. And when they come to play to me, and they come to play Elgar to me, as soon as they start, I know whether they've copied Jackie or not. And you know, but if they have, I think, oh no, you know, I'm going to unpick this. but no, Tortellier to me was a terrific cellist, and of course these incredible masterclasses where he does tend to sound a bit like Inspector Clouseau, but that endeared him to a massive audience on BBC TV in his masterclasses, and there are many of them on YouTube, and well worth watching.
Fiona, Tortellier?
Absolutely, but I think because I rather hoped Julian might have Tortellier on his list, and also because Julian decided only to go with those who we have lost. Just to put in a word for Stephen Isserlis, who's done, I mean, he's such the personality shines through his music making. He's an adventurer when it comes to repertoire. He's an advocate. He's persuasive, and he's serious, and he's fun. And I can't really imagine the cello without him.
Oh, I agree that, I mean, Stephen, one of the great things about him is that he has been so adventurous with the repertoire. He's not just been content to play the same pieces. And I think with the cello, it's something that we ought to keep in mind all the time, because, you know, the violin, the piano, they do have a wider repertoire. Rostropovich did a huge amount to address that. But I think, Yo-Yo, Stephen, you know, these are players who've tried really hard to expand the music that they play and the repertoire for the instrument, and I think that's vitally important. When I used to think, if there are two composers I wish had written a concerto for cello, and the difference it would have made in the concert hall to the number of cello appearances you'd have, I would have chosen Mendelssohn and Sibelius, and I wish we had cello concertos by then.
I was going to mention Sol Gabetta actually as another sort of young adventurous cellist who was rather I think the Proms audience rather took to her, I can't remember, was it last year or recently anyway, with doing an encore, a very modern encore where she's singing along with it too. These cellists who sort of push the boundaries a little bit, but are also fantastic communicators. I mean, I actually think that's what Sheku Kenner-Mason has as well. He has that ability to connect with audiences just like that. And I remember watching him, like almost everybody else, the first time I came across him was in the string finals of the Young Musician of the Year. There were just a couple of moments in his playing which really, they just got to me. And it so rarely happens. You're often in awe of the ability, the technical ability, particularly of these young musicians these days. It's absolutely extraordinary. But they very rarely touch you in that way. And he really did. And in a way, I'm slightly disappointed that sort of Decca have grabbed him and done what they've done, what they often do with with musicians in that particular way. But those particular moments, I think it was the Rachmaninoff that he played, was just sensational and was something quite special. Fiona.
I think we've got the BBC Young Musician to thank for 2 or 3 cellists, actually, because Natalie Klein and Guy Johnson were also winners. And they're both really... And
Van Hagen.
Yes.
She's also a very fine cellist.
I've always been a big fan of Natalie Klein. I always liked the fact that she didn't go down the celebrity route as soon as she won, and she went back to studying and kept at it. I think her playing has benefited enormously from that very mature attitude. And I've got to mention Guy Johnston, because his parents live about 500 yards up the road from me, and the Johnstons are Harpenden legends. So I have to mention him, of course. Well, and of course he broke a string famously in the concerto final, playing the Shostakovich one, didn't he?
Oh, now I can tell you a Sheku story here, because I was actually judging that string final, and he broke a string, and of course they didn't show that. But you know, he dealt, and he was off stage for a huge amount of time. I think he didn't have a spare string or something, and you know, but he came back and was you know, just straight back into the performance again. And I felt he had something extremely special. Just that's he has the ability to touch people's hearts, and that's really what it's all about.
Richard?
Well, I think just it's important to say about Sheku is like Tommy just said about Natalie Klein. He's gone back to college. He's still at college. As far as he's concerned, he's still a student. He's having his weekly lessons. He's making music with his friends and with his family, of course, his remarkable family. He's very aware of where he is and where he needs to go, and he seems to me to have a very serious, very intelligent approach to developing his art. It may perhaps not be what the record label PRs are showing us. I don't know how much that relates to what he's really about and where he's going. And I think I'm very, very interested to see where he is in 10 years, in 20 years, like Natalie Klein, like Guy Johnson, like these other people we've mentioned. But also, I mean, I know we sort of had a rule last week when James McMillan was on, we're not doing any fanboy stuff, but I've got to say, when I was preparing my grade 8, I caused outrage with my teachers by announcing I wasn't going to be playing the Brahms E minor sonata because I'd somehow fallen in love with Alan Rawsthorne's cello sonata. Well, we needed a recording. No one knew how it went except me, and I'd only played the cello part. So there was only one recording, and I think we know who made it. It's Julian had made that recording. Just he made recordings in the 80s of people like of Bridge, of John Ireland, recorded the Sullivan Cello Concerto. His recording of the Miaskovsky is one of my personal favourites. All these things introduced me to repertoire I'd never even come across before. So I think it's, you know, credit where credit's due. I know he commissioned the Rodrigo's concerto, Serenade Concerto for cello. There's many other works. It's not fair not to mention that in passing since he's here. I don't want to spare his blushes, obviously, but not going too fanboy on this. But and his book Travels with My Cello, that was sort of constantly by my bedside in my sort of early teens. That was just, you know, it was fun. It made me enjoy what I was doing a great deal.
There you go. There's quite enough of that, Julia. Okay. Julian, you don't have to respond to all this if you don't want to. Can I?
You know, one of the things I really did try to do was, you know, when you're with one of these major labels, and Sheku will no doubt find all this out, you know, they basically do want you to record, understandably, I suppose, the things that are going to sell. And I used to really enjoy trying to sneak, if you could call that, a piece like the Miaskovsky Cello Concerto onto, I think it was only the second recording of the work after Rostropovich, you know, onto something like Tchaikovsky Rococo Variations, which, you know, and of course it's disaster for the sales, I guess, but, you know, I used to like to try to do that as much as I could, because I've always felt this repertoire needs expanding. You know, the cello in particular needs a wider repertoire, and so I think that's a really important thing. I'm sure Sheku will go on to do that.
Before we wind up, we have mentioned him, but only really very briefly. But can we
Casals.
go any further without mentioning Casals? Yeah, we can't really, can we?
No, we can't. I mean, Casals was the father figure of the whole thing. Well, I suppose we did mention him in relation to Studia, and that would have annoyed him so much. Brilliant. But Yes, I mean, he was phenomenal. Of course, the Bach Suite recordings, again, incredibly personal, but they just, you listen to them and are there thoroughly convincing. And his Dvorak is I guess one thing, if you were going to be, in any sense, critical about Casals, which obviously I will now get shot, but he didn't do, for me, enough to expand the repertoire, but that doesn't take anything away from his incredible playing. And I mean, he revolutionized cello technique, and one must never forget that.
The story I've always understood was that he was basically the man who put the Bach suites into the repertoire, or at least the concert repertoire. I don't know how much that's sort of posthumous myth-making, but I mean, if that's true, I mean, that's pretty massive, isn't it? It does sort of make him the daddy of us all.
Yes, I mean, yes, he was. It is true. He was the cellist that started to play those in public as a serious piece of music, and not just exercises. But I think they were thought of in that way before. So yes, of course, that's a phenomenal change to the cello repertoire. But I guess it's his own generation of composers that I don't think, he possibly could have got a major work out of Debussy, and he didn't.
Fiona?
Just to fast forward to two players whose names haven't come up in this, but who I think make you think about the Bach, and there must be almost no cellist who hasn't recorded or wanted to record the Bach suites. And that's Alban Gerhardt, who has really made an absolute journey into that work, but also is someone I personally always want to listen to, whether he's playing Ligeti or whether he's playing Bach. And the other is a player whose career was cut short by, I don't know exactly, some sort of injury, and that was David Watkins, who played the Bach suites with what we broadly call a period instrument intelligence, different style of playing, but really fantastic music making. And he made this recording before he had to stop playing. And he's not very old now, I don't know. I think he's conducting, but lovely, lovely musicianship.
I'm so pleased you mentioned Alban Gerhardt. He was on my list, actually. I first came across him when I was at Radio 3. We did a festival of music by Benjamin Britten in Birmingham at Symphony Hall with all the BBC orchestras and CBSO, I think. Alban Gerhardt played the Britten Cello Symphony, which is not really a piece I'd known very well, and it isn't performed as much as one might imagine. I think a lot of people find it quite a difficult piece as an audience, as much as players. But he played it from memory, which, if anyone knows that piece, is pretty impressive. And again, one of those great communicators. Exactly what Julian was saying at the beginning about that. The music stand being the barrier often between the player and the audience. That's exactly what it was like with Gerhardt, I think. He just communicated this piece that many people in the audience, I think, probably were hearing for the first time, particularly live. And he really sold that piece to the audience. And I think it's a piece that needed selling. It was a fabulous performance, totally unforgettable. Richard, you're desperate to come in here.
Oh, well, Gerhardt, yes. Well, he, we're talking about commissioning a new repertoire. I mean, I was going through his repertoire earlier. I mean, he commissioned Unzucht, Jörg Widmann, Brett Dean, Julian Anderson, Matthias Pincher. He makes a point of memorizing all these works before performing them, which is bloody extraordinary, really. And I've got to say, I interviewed him last year, and he gives great interview. He admittedly didn't particularly, Bach was not central to his repertoire. He had never really felt any great connection with Bach. He'd worked very, very hard to do these suites simply because he felt he was under an obligation to do them, and he'd worked incredibly hard to get away into them. He found a way in apparently through the Dutch period cellist Anna Bilsma, who died recently. That was, but as well as this, he is staggeringly rude about various other icons of the cello world, all of which is on the record. So I can tell you that he said that Yo-Yo Ma's Bach suites are the most boring cello playing he'd ever heard, and that Daniel Schafran is of no interest to anyone except cellists, and that what he's doing is not playing, it's pornography. And this kind of thing makes a journalist's heart skip, I have to tell you, especially when it's all on the record. I can't believe it.
Presumably that's the point.
Well, he's what a personality as well as what an artist. I mean, and has the authority to say these things because he is putting it out there. Putting his money where his mouth is, his bow where his mouth is, and actually building the repertoire, taking the risks. Absolutely, being honest as a musician and as an individual. The other one I just wanted to mention was Daniel Muller-Schott, who a much less outspoken character than Alban Gerhardt, but he has recently recorded a Kadai solo sonata, which for the benefit of non-cellists is the kind of thing you just look at it and your eyes start to bleed. And this recording is just wow! It's just whoa! This is virtuosity. This is command.
Well, I think the problem is we probably could spend the rest of the day going through all 49 of Fiona's choices, for example. There are a lot of cellists, I think we agree. Julian, while I've got you, I do want to ask you about your father and his music and the fact that you've played his music. I want to know what the difference is. Obviously, you've played your brother's music and very famously, with Variations, which I still think is Andrew's finest work. I really do. I think that's a fabulous, great recording as well. The original one from the 70s. But what about your father's work? The last time I saw you in person, although I didn't get a chance to say hello because you were whisked away, was in Worcester Cathedral when you and Andrew were watching a performance of your father's orchestral work. It seemed to me, even from a short distance, that actually still performances of your father's work are incredibly important to you and very personal, of course, to you. But what about also performing his music? Is that particularly special?
When I played, Andrew's music and my father's music, I never sort of had to think about how they wanted it to go. It just felt totally natural to play those pieces. So from that point of view, it was sort of quite easy. Andrew's actually really quite critical to work with. That recording, he really has his ideas. One of the things I've found about working with composers, when I was young and starting off, like I played the Bliss cello concerto and worked with composers like John McCabe and Peter Racine Fricker. I recorded his cello sonata. But I found that composers on the whole were just you would go to them thinking, oh dear, they're going to tear this apart because they wrote it. They were so grateful that you were actually playing their music that they didn't. And so Andrew was a bit different. I have to say that. He really has his views about how things should go and can be very, very critical, as could my father. But the thing about my father was that basically he was writing music very out of step with its time. And he simply stopped writing altogether in the early 50s because he just felt it wasn't going to get accepted in the right way. That work, Aurora, I think we ought to hear it more because it really is. It's a 10-minute work. In fact, the first performance I've got was Alexander Gibson up in Scotland, and he takes 8 minutes, and it's a really, really passionate, almost like Tchaikovsky, you could say. That's the way my father was, and so writing up 50 years out of his time. But I think that's a really good piece and should be heard.
But is it Romance that you play of your father's work? Is it called Romance?
Yes, he wrote several pieces for cello. There's one called In the Half-Light, there's a Nocturne. The Romance, I actually arranged that for cello and piano. They're lovely pieces.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Julian. It's been a real pleasure to have you here and to have all this
go on
talk
for
about.
life,
We really could, couldn't we?
We could.
We certainly could, but you've got a conservatoire to get back to. We really do appreciate you being here, and it's been absolutely fascinating. As always, you can find all of our Classical Top 5 podcasts on the website and also at the Podbean website and also on Facebook, on our Facebook page. You just have to search for Classical Top 5. We're also on iTunes and Spotify. Please do like us and rate us if you can. It does always help to get the word out there. But for now, once again, thank you so much, as always, to Fiona and to Richard, and especially to Julian Lloyd Webber for joining us. And we'll look forward to speaking to you all again next week.